We continue the conversation, the money talks, but this time we're talking about the issue of minimum wage. There has not been an agreement yet. Of course, the SGF has said that the committee will continue to meet for 1 week to come up with a deal. The president has directed the finance minister to come up with a minimum wage template. And so we're looking at all the documents. We've seen a draft of that document and some of the shortfalls, challenges, vision board, and how to accomplish some of those visions from the finance minister. But how does all of this affect people in the private sector, which is why it's called a tripartite committee? So the private, labor, as well as the government. We're being joined on the program by the Director General, Nigeria Employers Consultative Association, and a member of the ILO Governing Board, Mr. Adewale Smart Oyerinde, joins us via Zoom. Mr. Oyerinde, thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you for having us. Good morning.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand you had said that if government succumbs to labor's demand of over 400,000 naira as minimum wage, which some people are saying is way over the top, it will cripple the economy. Some labor people say, do you think we don't deserve this money? So maybe you explain that, if that is correct.
Thank you very much. I think where you started from is quite apt, because that is the foundation of this conversation, and it's also very important to correct the misconception that is out there in the public. What the committee was inaugurated to do was to recommend a new national minimum wage. We are not to negotiate salary increases. We are not to negotiate new salaries. It was a new national minimum wage, the amount below which no employer in the private or public sector should pay. Other fundamental issues like cost of living adjustment and so many issues about welfare and the rest, most times they are negotiated at the sectoral level. It's very important we get this right. The sectoral level, where we have industrial unions and industrial employer federations. At that level, some meet every year to negotiate new collective bargaining agreements. Some meet every 2 years to negotiate new collective bargaining agreement, and some meet 3 years to negotiate key issues around cost of living adjustment, COLA, around welfare issues. That happens at that sectoral level. What this specific committee was inaugurated to recommend is a new national minimum wage. Now, is 415,000 or even 615,000, is it okay? Absolutely, it is okay. If the economy and if those that will pay it can carry the burden. I call it a burden, not because the employees do not deserve it, but because the moment it becomes a path towards fatality for those that will pay it, then it becomes a burden. For the private sector, which I will likely focus on, the critical issues that the private sector faces, we all know it. It's there for everybody to see. The multiplicity of taxes that we've mentioned over time. When we mention private sector pays over 60 different taxes, levies, and fees per annum, people think it's just statistics. What we should ask ourselves is, why will many organizations, many businesses be either closing shop or relocating or changing their mode of operation? Why would that be happening if they can't survive? Some have said it is not only wages that causes those businesses to leave. Absolutely, not only wages, but the circumstantial factors surrounding each business compromises its ability to do certain things, and which is part of the issue of these wage issues. We have committed to the issue of national minimum wage. We are absolutely committed to review the new national minimum wage, because it is time to do it according to the law. Are we also committed to the issue of a living wage? Employers, Nigerian Employers Consultative Association, even at the global level in ILO here, there is an agreement between the workers' body and the employers' body that yet it is time for us to start talking about a living wage. But there must be a framework for us to discuss this living wage. That framework was approved in the March governing body meeting of the ILO, that the tripartite should start that conversation. So what we are negotiating, or what we are to recommend to the president, is a minimum wage, below which, some have called it the floor wage, below which nobody can pay. For the private sector, it is there for everybody to see. The challenges are there. The risks that we face are there. In the last one month, we've also faced the issue of the new electricity tariff. Those are part of the issues that people don't factor in. And lastly, for my opening comment, it will also surprise you that currently most private sector organizations, they put all their employees on HMO, the Health Management Services, which covers the employee, the wife, and 4 children. We currently do that in the organized private sector. Every organized private sector organization also pays 10% of the employees' salary for pension. We pay 1% of payroll to NSITF to take care of injuries arising during or in the course of work for the employee. We pay 1% to ITF for the training of our staff. We pay so many of those levies that we pay on a monthly basis. Let's factor it into this conversation of minimum wage. And lastly, we've discussed minimum wage for over 4 months. And quite unfortunately, the issue of productivity has not really factored in. I think it's time we focus on a minimum wage that is basically minimum. Every employer can pay above it. Those state governments have declared 70,000 minimum wage. It doesn't mean they will come down if what is eventually recommended is below 70. We have employers in the private sector currently paying far above the 60,000. It all boils down to the ability to pay.
All right, and that's where I was planning to take off from, the fact that some employers in the private sector are already paying above the minimum wage. But that makes it curious to learn that the first offer of the private sector during negotiations was 57 naira against the federal government's initial 54,000 naira. I'm wondering why that is, or if that's what private sector employers are paying currently as minimum wage. And really, what would be an ideal living wage in the thinking of private sector employers amid these negotiations? What's practical against the backdrop of the current economic indicators?
Now, first, the private sector offered 54,000. The government offered 48. Then in the course of the conversation, we had made consultation with sectoral executives, sectoral groups. We upped the figure to 57. And then before we landed on 60, and the federal government matched our figure. Now, I also want us to be guided, on this issue, on this conversation about living wage. We are not talking living wage; it is minimum wage that we are discussing. And conversation for a living wage, as I said, we are open to it. Employers at the local and the global level are open to that conversation because every worker deserves a living wage. But for this conversation that we're having, and for the purpose of the law that we are supposed to review, the ongoing conversation is a minimum wage, the below which no employer should pay. Now, you mentioned the issue of some employers paying above the current recommendation, and that is absolutely true. Now, if you look at the industrial groups, you have the food and beverages, you have the oil and gas, you have the chemical and non-metallic, you have shop and distributive, over 20, 30 different sectoral groups. Now, at those sectoral groups, many of them have their own minimum wage at the sector level, because I said collective bargaining goes on at those sectoral levels every year, most times in the oil and gas. In the food and beverages and some others, they negotiate every 2 years. In some others, they negotiate every 3 years. So progressively, every 2 years, every 3 years, they negotiate terms and conditions of employment. They negotiate their own minimum wage. So some are quite far above our current proposal, and some are also far behind. So what the private sector did was to look at what exactly is the whole figure that everybody is paying, from the highest payer to the lowest payer. Some companies in the private sector are paying 35,000 when it was 30. Some are paying 40,000. Some are paying 45,000. Now, look at the whole sector, what everybody is paying. And statistically, you try and get the mean, you try and get the mode. Now, the fourth quartile will be those paying highest because they could pay. Now, the middle quartile, what they call median, is probably the figure in the middle. And now we are looking at the minimum so that you don't put much pressure on those that could not pay, and you don't destroy them. That way, we'll be cutting our nose to spite our face. Now, you look at what is the band between the first quartile and the second quartile. That is where the minimum actually falls in. So that those below the minimum, you can get them to move up. So what our recommended, our proposal of minimum should be, and that is where the 45,000, 54,000 fell into. Because the risk is this. If you go beyond what should be the minimum, what the minimum proposal should be, then you have set up yourself for two critical issues. One, those that could not meet up, you probably pack up, and then your rate of unemployment will increase. That is one. Two, you're also setting up yourself for a high level of non-compliance.
Right.
Because the committee will have recommended, completed this assignment, leave the table, then we start dealing with the issue of non-compliance.
Okay.
The biggest victory we can win in this conversation is to ensure compliance. Because even when it was 30,000, many state governors were not paying 30,000. So the biggest victory for us will be ensuring compliance.
Mr. Oyenride, just to be clear, so again, to put the facts out there, now that they're negotiating above 60,000 naira, is the private sector also following suit? Are you in support of this beyond the 54,000 naira, just to be clear?
Now, we have asked the committee because it was government that made the commitment.
Right.
It was between government and organized labor. They've come up with the agreement that government will pay above 60. So what we are asking is, what exactly does it mean? Where exactly does it leave us? If the bipartite is agreeing, there's no problem with the agreement. There's no problem with the commitment. It's within the right of government to meet labor. It's also within the right of government to meet the employers to say, okay, this is what we want to consider. These are the concessions that we are going to give. So it is within the right of government. But we are waiting for government to share what exactly are they offering to enable us also go back to our constituents. We have the constituent of the private sector to also go back to, and this is what government have said, and then we get the mandate from the organized private sector for us to cross the bridge when we eventually get there. But for now, no figure has been touted.
Right, but did you at least climb up to the 60,000 level with government at that point? Just to be clear. Okay, so
at this point, we are 60,000. We've over 60,000, painfully.
Right. Just quickly, pardon me, Mr. Oyenride. So when you talk about the minimum wage and the living wage, this debate was also put up at the National Assembly yesterday, saying instead of talking minimum, let's talk living. Please, what is, if 60,000 naira is a minimum wage, so what should be a living wage? So we're clear on this one.
That is part of the confusion. And with due respect to the National Assembly, this pattern of shortcutting a process, it's quite worrisome to us. There is a process of setting a national minimum wage. It is not done through political intervention. It is not done. You create problems. There's a process. The National Minimum Wage Committee is to meet and make a recommendation to the president. We don't necessarily have to agree. It's the reality of it. And so we don't model all these things up. We don't necessarily have to agree. We have to meet and then send a recommendation to the president. The president and commander-in-chief has the prerogative, the sole prerogative, to approve whatever is recommended or not to approve it. It's as simple as that. The buck rests on the table of the president. So with highest respect to the office of the Senate President and the Speaker of the House, calling a party to discuss an issue that is handled by the tripartite, look, it's not subjected to the tripartite. While those issues are allowable, we can consult, but we urge that let this process, this particular process, let it follow its course to the point where the committee will make its recommendation. We have to make a recommendation. We all don't have to necessarily agree personally.
All right, Mr. Ayorinde, I wanted to find out, because one thing has been missing in this whole debate, and the only people that have actually given us some data to play with is organized labor, which is how they landed at 615, and they're coming down to over 400,000. So for the private sector that made that initial proposal and is still at 60 where the government is, what are the variables that were considered? What are the variables here?
I just shared the variables with you. You know, we are looking at the minimum. So you collect all the figures from all the sectors. The sector that is paying 35, the sector that is paying 40, the sector that is paying 55, the sector that is paying 70. You bring all those figures together. You know, you look for the average, you look for the mode, and you look for you walk through the quartiles and get where the minimum should be. Even the figure that was presented, the analysis you presented, there was a component that was health, health for the employee. You know, for us, these are the issues. The employer currently takes care of the health, the HMO for the employee, taking care of the employee, the wife, and then 4 children. And again, we are talking of minimum wage. Our strong view is this: if minimum wage is the lowest that an individual should earn, the lowest for the most vulnerable employee, now the variable of productivity, the variable of skill, the variable of competence should be a critical factor in shaping the direction of where the wage should go at that minimum. We're not bringing the issue of productivity to the issue. We are just talking of apportioning wage now. Labour brought the list they brought their analysis, but they did not bring, and you did not ask, what is the productivity quotient in this? So we should just look at this issue holistically and address those issues. Our point remains this: it is the minimum for the most vulnerable worker. It is not the maximum. Those that can pay 100 can pay 100. Those that can pay 150 as minimum wage, they are free to pay. But this figure is to protect the most vulnerable worker, so that no employer exploits immoral.
It's a great point you made, but it sounds more like an aggregation of arithmetic than looking at reflecting current economic reality or progressive economic reality for some people that are listening. Don't you think so?
Now, it would be unfair for you to look at those economic realities from one perspective. We have mentioned the issue of inflation rate affecting the disposable income of an average Nigerian. But you have not mentioned the interest rates. A business that borrowed money, that collected a loan from a bank at 5 or 7%. Now interest rate is how much? It's over 2 digits. But we're not addressing the reality for that business. The forex, a business that collected forex when it was 800, and he asked now to repay when it was 1,004. We're not addressing the realities of that business, and you're also not addressing the reality of those that have lost their jobs. The reality of Nigerians that have lost their jobs through the businesses that have closed shop. We're not addressing the realities for them. We're addressing one part of the realities. We have to bring all those realities to the plate. GSK has left Nigeria, Sanofi have left Nigeria, many other businesses are leaving Nigeria. What happened to the employees of those businesses? Everybody is quiet. Are they not Nigerians? Those are the issues. So we have to bring all these issues, bring it to the pot, and I think that's what the committee is trying to do now. And let's look at all these issues. We're all Nigerians. Nobody is trying to exploit anybody, but let's create an environment that is conducive for the organized private sector to operate, and we have communicated this to government. And then when the situation for all of us continue to improve, then we are in a better position to discuss the issue of living wage. But for now, we are discussing minimum wage. And when the ILO, which is the father or the grandfather of this whole concept of minimum wage, when we agree on the framework for living wage, then all of us can turn back and then use that framework. Because now, if you ask 100 persons to define what was the context of living wage, you probably will have 100 different contexts to what a living wage should be. But the ILO has given us a parameter for a minimum wage, and we're a strong constituent of the ILO. So that process I've started to come up with a framework for a living wage. So let's wait till that framework is completed. Then we can start that conversation at the highest level. But I must re-emphasize this. At the sectoral level, negotiation on improved term and condition of employment, negotiation on cost of living adjustment, it goes on every year, every 2 years, and every 3 years. And also at the private sector, through the instrumentality of appraisers in an annual basis, businesses will still increase salaries by 10, 15, 20% every year through the instrumentality of performance appraisal.
And Labour is also taking into cognizance the productivity quotient that you talk about, and perhaps that's why they have said repeatedly amid negotiations that they are not particularly focused on volume but on value, and by extension they're calling on government to guarantee that whatever figure is agreed upon, the economic indicators would be able to, in the long term, sustain it. And that leads me to my next question. Is government also listening to the yearnings of the private sector to the extent that they are providing assurances that the business environment would be one that will guarantee your ability, the employer's ability to be able to pay whatever wage that is agreed upon? That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, it appears as if there's an emerging consensus on a figure or figures between 90 and 100,000. You're saying that in the final analysis, it will be dependent on the ability, the unique ability of each employer will be to pay. But the minimum wage negotiations would eventually end up becoming law. Would those not paying after it becomes law not be in breach of the law?
Thank you very much. First, on the issue of the economy, unfortunately, employers cannot, they can't go on strike because we have to keep working so that the employees can be at work, basically. Now, I think we've consistently engaged government on the need to quickly address the macroeconomic issues. Because on the long run, the whole conversation rests on the economy. If we agree on, or if there is a recommendation of 1 million naira as minimum wage, if the economy is not strong enough, the 1 million that you have collected will be made nonsense of by the cost of living, by the high cost of living. Because the kind of environment we run in our country, once the minimum wage is announced, the market woman will increase the cost of selling tomato. The landlord will also increase, marginally increase the cost of rent. So what you think you have gained, you probably lose it. So everything rests on the economy. You know, the government must do whatever is necessary, and urgently also, to address all the macroeconomic issues that we have. If the macroeconomic indices are strong, then even if you arrive at 20,000 minimum wage or 30,000 maximum wage, the value of that 20 or 30,000 will be sufficient to take care of your needs so that the agitation will be less. That is one part of this. So a lot rests on government, and we've continuously advocated to government on the need and what exactly to do in order of priorities. The second part is the issue of there is a I can't remember what you call it now, consensus. I'm struggling to understand the context of the consensus, but this is a tripartite. So any consensus out of the tripartite, it remains, is allowable, is desirable, but on the long run, it's going to come back to the issue of the tripartite making a recommendation. And what we are trying to avoid is this, and we have communicated to all stakeholders. You might agree on a figure. We also have the instruments, the strong instruments to monitor and to enforce. Now, every employee from the 2019 law, if you are dissatisfied, if you see your employer is not paying, you can approach either individually or as group, approach the National Industrial Court. Now,
well, Mr. Enrude, I wonder what will then become of your job eventually. if you approach the industrial courts. But
let me create this scenario for you.
Okay, we're winding down, but we need to put in two questions, but you can quickly land on that. Quick.
No, let me create this scenario. You have employers, either at the state or federal level, that couldn't pay. Then everybody now approaches the National Industrial Court. You have 10, 15, 100, 20, 300 cases at the different jurisdiction of the Industrial Court. Those cases will also take about 3 or 4 or 5 years before the judges will dispense with all those cases. You just created a rigmarole, a sequence of negative events that will not end. So, as I said, the biggest win we can get from this process is a commitment to compliance.
All right.
The state government,
so let's wind down on this.
Federal government, on the private sector.
So let's wind down on this, Mr. Ayorinde. What is the chunk that private sector employs in Nigeria's employment sector, if I call it the employment population? What is the percentage that the private sector is taking on? Do you have those figures?
Well, I'm unable to give you the exact figure, but hypothetically, I can share this with you. And it's globally accepted, global consensus, that for every 10 jobs created, the private sector creates 8 of them.
Okay, so hypothetically speaking, 80%.
The substantial, and those substantial part of the jobs are created by the SMEs. And those are another conversation that we are discussing, because the SMEs are also in a pilot state now. So if you also create a situation for the SMEs that will not enable them to survive, to be sustainable, not competitive now, to be sustainable.
Right, we understand that point, Mr. Ayorinde.
We're also creating different.
And I think it's a vital part of the conversation to have. But just to wind down, on a final note, for people who work in the private sector, who have been following this debate and the negotiation, and they were happy when the strike was called because they're like, at least someone is fighting for us. Are you saying they should not keep their hopes high, just in case, like this might not affect them?
In 1 minute, I'll share this with you. During COVID...
No. It's a yes or no, Mr. Ayorinde, then you can share it. Should they keep their hopes high or just maintain status quo?
There's nothing... They should be hopeful.
You can share the story, Mr. Ayorinde, quickly.
During COVID, when businesses were not working and employees were forced to stay at home, organized businesses rose up responsibly to continue to pay salaries. In fact, we had an MOU with organized labor that private sector will not retrench any worker during that period, and we are responsible enough to keep to that MOU. We were responsible enough to ensure that even welfare issues were addressed. Even when subsidy was removed, we were the first to change mode of businesses, mode of our operations. We went to hybrid. Businesses come up with different palliatives for their employees. Those were good times. But now, if you look, the circumstances is different. Everybody, we all have to make definitive sacrifices. And if you are going to take any action whatsoever that might compromise the fate or the survival of the business, then the organized businesses also will do everything that is necessary to protect its survival. We have laws here. We have laws, we have provisions that have been made in the law to guide our actions and inactions. So we just urge all of us to be law-abiding and to respect constituted authority, irrespective of our personal dispositions.
All right. Ms. Ayorinde, must thank you for coming on the program. Adewale Smart Ayorinde is Director General of Nigeria Employers Consultative Association, also a member of ILO governing board. Thank you so much. As day 3 into that negotiation, we hope that by day 5, we'll not go back to what happened on Monday. Hopefully. But I wish you the very best. Thank you for your perspective.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.